And welcome back. We are here with Nick Dwyer, who is behind the video series Digging in the Carts turned radio show turned kind of live event series, which is taking the people behind kind of classic video game music like Streets of Rage and really just elevating their art form and going into how video game music used to be made. And how did video game music used to be made?
Oh man, back in the day, it was a laborious, long process. I mean, if you go right back, it was, if you speak to people like Hip Tanaka, who was part of the series, the video series, and he was one of the first composers at Nintendo back in the day. But he got to start making sound effects for Nintendo arcade machines, and it was all like transistors and capacitors and very, very like rudimentary tools. And then as things progressed, a lot of numbers, it was all coding. They had no way to play back things, so you have to burn ROMs.
Yeah. I think there's a misconception that like video game music is just as simple as like making something on a synthesizer and then kind of porting it over into the game. And kind of more recently that's the case, but back then you really had to build it from the ground up.
Right.
Absolutely, man. I mean, one of the coolest things, I don't know if any of you guys have seen it or any of the audience has seen it, but the Digging the Carts video series, one of my favorite parts is there's this woman called Junko Ozawa who was one of the early composers at Namco. And Namco in the early mid-'80s were kind of the company that was pioneering video game music. And basically they kind of revolutionized video game music with what was called wavetable synthesis. So basically what that would mean is, back in the day, and sorry to get too technical, but you would have like PSG sounds. You'd have like simple square waves and what have you that, could produce certain sound like a sound wave. But with wavetable synthesis, they could start creating their own bespoke sound waves. And what they would do is they would record the sound of instruments like violins and cellos, study the waveforms, and then they would kind of draw them and kind of create these 8-bit sounds that would sound as close as they could to guitars and cellos, and they were all just doing it like hand-drawn waves. And she shows the audience her book of her own waves that she created, and she calls them her treasures. And it's a really, really beautiful moment in the series, and it just goes to show you that, back in those days, it was a long, laborious, it was a difficult, cumbersome process.
So Nick, because of those limitations, we got so much we got so many amazing video games, we got amazing video game music, because I think that sort of when you're limited with the amount of space you can use, you're limited the amount of colors you can use when designing a video game, great art comes from those limitations. But nowadays, video game music is just music. Right. So, is there still a really big community holding on to that original sort of limitation and using that as an inspiration to creating?
Well, look, man, I mean, you completely and utterly nailed it, and it goes for all art. Some of the greatest art comes when people have limitations, and especially this kind of evolution of video game music is almost paralleled with the evolution of electronic music, where some of the most revolutionary electronic music, be it early house, be it jungle, it was composers and producers just getting inside. They'd have one machine, they'd have one sampler, and they would just get inside that piece of technology and more often than not push it way beyond what the original intention for that machine was. And there's a couple of things that play with the early era of video game music, and especially Japanese video game music, that I absolutely love. And one is exactly that. It's these limitations that forced them to be creative, and they would sit there and just figure out ways that they could come up with new techniques to do phasing or echoes or all these sorts of things. But also it was the accident. A lot of these composers were heavily inspired by, say, Japanese fusion, or they were listening to jazz, and they were trying to create jazz or create fusion, but with sound channels, and not getting there, obviously. But it was the accident of not getting there that created something truly original as a byproduct. And when the CD era came in, when things became like, it all switched to MIDI, then they could just make jazz, they could just make fusion, they could just make rock. But really, I think, myself and I know millions of other people around the world love so much about that era is that it was its own unique form of electronic music. And I guess that's what we've been trying to do, I think, first of all, with the video series, is to first and foremost get people to understand that, yes, there were these men and women making this music. Because when you're a kid, you don't think that there's someone
Yeah.
like going, I just went to a club. Like, think about Yuzo Koshiro. Max, you just held me up before we started this interview, the Streets of Rage soundtrack, and he was 20 years old. It was at the height of there you go. It was the height of the bubble era in Tokyo, which if anyone knows, like Japan was experiencing an economic boom in the late 80s. The clubs were booming, house and techno had arrived, and young video game composers like Yuzo, he would go out, he'd hear the latest house and techno from Detroit and Chicago, and then go back to his house and then try and create that on a Megadrive, like with FM synthesis.
What I love about this is he's still like, he's a salaried game developer.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like he had a keyboard in his garage and he's like, I'm gonna be the next big like house musician. He was like, oh, I'm making a component for a piece of software. And then, decades later, you're approaching him and being like, "Hey, do you want to do that live?" How do you make that leap from like doing those hand-drawn waveforms to doing this as a live performance?
Okay, so it was an interesting one. And always with evolving. Right from the moment we did the Digging the Cards video series, I always kind of had this bigger kind of picture in mind, which was to kind of bring the world of Japanese video game music closer together with the electronic music world from, outside of Japan that it heavily inspired. And if you look at the video series, you've got a large part of the most influential electronic music and the most cutting edge electronic music producers in the world right now, who all say, people like Flying Lotus, people like Thundercat, people like Just Blaze, who all say, without a doubt, what prepped me for a future of electronic loops. What got me into electronic music was the music of video games, and in particular, Japanese video games. And it was all those hours and hours with the Blanca theme going on in the background, or being stuck on a particular Mario stage, but the music was so dope that you didn't, you kept playing it because those guys really cared about the loop. I'm going on a tangent anyway.
You're completely on point. I produce music myself, and that's absolutely something that got me into it to begin with. And I think with the way we look at motion pictures now, you have people like Hans Zimmer, you have John Williams. You see their names, and it's big, it's iconic. They just announced that John Williams is doing the music for Episode 9, and it's a big news story. He's a household name. But with video games, we don't really have that yet. How do we sort of raise that awareness? How do we sort of get, like, what are you guys doing specifically to kind of get those names into the vernacular of people?
Well, I think definitely things are starting to happen. And going back to what you were saying before, going back to what we were saying before, with this idea of doing evolving it into the compilation, and then the live series is first and foremost, the documentary series was to explain the context, to explain the context, to let people know that there was a story behind it, and these incredible men and women who, as you say, they were like salary men, salary women, they were ordinary office workers who would just go into their office and sit in a tiny cubicle, and they'd want to know, how can I make this the player's experience the most enjoyable and give them music that won't tire them. I think with doing the Digging the Cards compilation, and especially teaming up with a label like Hyperdub, which is, within the electronic music spectrum, they're one of the most respected labels for cutting edge electronic music. And, Code 9, who's the boss of the label, really got it. And the idea was, we didn't want it to be just a greatest hits. We didn't want it to be like just big Final Fantasy tunes or Mario tunes. We listened, went through the entire history and picked out pieces of music that, when you take them out of the game and just listen to them on their own as a piece of music, it is incredible, pioneering electronic music. And then when you all of a sudden add to that the backstory and the context of how difficult it was to make that piece of music, really, you kind of start to really see it as a thing of beauty. And then finally with these live shows, in terms of globally, video game music has been celebrated for decades now, with orchestras performing, be it the music of Zelda or the music of Final Fantasy, music of Dragon Quest. That's very much, a celebration of composition, right? And without a doubt, Koji Kondo, Nobuo Uematsu, Koichi Sugiyama, incredible composers. And testament to that is, like, if you go on Classic FM, which is, I think, the biggest classical music radio station in the world, and their top 100, it's constantly filled now with music from people like Nobuo Uematsu and video game music. But I think for us, it was a celebration of that era and that sound palette, like the sound palette of that chip era, and we wanted to try and bring, you know, that sound palette, that vibe from that era to the live stage. And to be honest, it wasn't that difficult. I mean, when I approached Yuzo, he thought I was crazy, but he was really, he really loved the video series. So he was like, "All right, Nick, you've got a big bold dream. I trust you. I'm going to get behind it." Because nothing like this had ever been done before, you know. And Yuzo had definitely, he's been involved in many of these, symphonic tributes to his music. And you know, we discussed it for, you know, we went back and forth on ideas and how we could build it. His old partner in crime, Motohiro Kawashima, who was involved in Streets of Rage 2, but heavily involved in Streets of Rage 3. He is, you know, he's 54 and he still produces like killer electronic music to this day. So, you know, we thought, look, we'll pair the both of them up, and the idea was to present the music exactly how it is on the game, but amplified on a massive club sound system, and, you know, and people really realized just how incredible it was. I mean, it's all, you know, it's all like they're using it's sequenced live, but basically they're using the exact same chip sounds, playing all the leads, you know, playing all the sound effects, you know, reworking certain things, affecting everything. But essentially what you're hearing is that music that was in the game, but just loud on some of the best club sound systems in the world. And
I love that.
You know, we had the first show in LA, and it was incredible. It was, you know, it was just because, you know, we'd done these practices, but we'd never heard it yet on a massive PA, and just everyone was just like had their mind blown. Like they were like, "Oh, so they've reworked this music, right? They've redone it." It's like, no, this is exactly how it sounded.
Well, I mean, it took 25 years, but it came from its inception in the club scene, and it actually finally hit the club, you know, there it is. Digging in the Carts, of course, the video series is out there for people to check out. There's also Digging in the Carts Radio. Where can people find that?
Yes, man. Red Bull Radio is where you can find Digging in the Carts radio series. It's, you know, I'm so thankful to those guys for giving me that opportunity. You know, I come from a background of radio. I've been doing radio for maybe, you know, 25 years, and to be able to, you know, basically go in and just research, you know, spend a couple of months listening through 250,000 tracks and then picking out my favorites to turn it into a radio series has been incredible. We did, the first season came out in 2016, and then we just had 2017, the new season's launched. The thing about Red Bull Radio is it is basically, unfortunately, if you're in the US, you cannot listen to it on demand, but if you Red Bull Radio, you can. It's replayed on the regular, and we've got a marathon coming up really, really soon. So it's great. Yeah. I mean, basically the whole season will be replayed a lot over the upcoming months, and then I'm just about to start getting into prep and research for season 3.
Wonderful.
Awesome,
check those out. And Nick, thank you so much for joining us. Real quick, real fast, if there's one track that people have to check out from the history of video game music, what is it?
Oh God, I get asked this a lot, and you know what? I don't deliberately mean to do this, but it just so happens that, you know, the more deep you dig, the shinier the treasures you find. Over the course of the last kind of couple of years, I've been, you know, I've listened to the entire history now of Japanese video game music, like 500,000 tracks. And there's this one guy called Manabu Saito, and his music is like nothing else. He sadly passed away at the age of 22 of kidney failure. And if he'd gone on to live, he would have been one of the greats. But he just made music for like all these Japanese home PCs that kind of never ever left Japan.
That's
even
a deep
Japan.
Cut. What's the one track? One track, gun to the head. What is it?
Oh God. You know what? I'm gonna give you something. I should really give you something more well. Manabu Saito is a composer, but I don't know. I think like if I'm gonna go for one track. Oh my God, what is that one track?
Big Blue from F-Zero.
I'm gonna go Nobuo Uematsu's Serpent Trench. Just awesome. Right now. It's just like it reminds me of Underground Resistance, and it's something that everyone can check off the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack. It's killer. People know that one.
Awesome. Nick, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody go check out Digging in the Carts, and we'll have more up at noon in just a second. Definitely go check out Digging in the Carts. If you haven't, it's on YouTube. You can watch it in its entirety. It's very cool, and there's a new season on the way. If you want some more Up at Noon digging into weird video game history, we took a look at some Nintendo artifacts, including a love tester. Watch Up at Noon every Thursday at noon Pacific time on everything that says IGN on it.